As you are aware, poverty is one of the determinants of nutrition. And we are grateful that the government of the Republic of Zambia is actually rolling out, or rather has really expanded the social cash transfer. And we had some earlier consultations in terms of how can we make social cash transfers nutrition sensitive. And we need some kind of concrete evidence that will help drive this process forward. And as you are aware, the Ministry of Community Development is spearheading the development of the social cash transfer policy. And we are trying to strengthen the nutrition component in the cash transfer process. So such evidence is key to help us make informed decisions. So this afternoon, we'll be availed with the findings of the study that was undertaken in Zambia in some 3 rural districts. And we have our guests here who will be able to present. Dr. Gershom Tembo, you are welcome. And Dr. Handa, you are also welcome. I would now ask you to proceed and share with us the outcomes from the study. Over to you.
Dr. Tembo will start the presentation, and then at some point I will continue. So over to Dr. Tembo. This is Ashu Handa from UNC Chapel Hill.
Good.
Hi, Ashu, thank you. And thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. This is Gershom Tembo. I'm presenting out of Palmer Associates. And this is work that we have been doing for years, since 2010, with Professor Handa. I'm going to share my screen right now. Let's see if the technology will allow me.
Okay.
Are people able to see the screen?
Yes, we are able to see the screen. I don't know, Kulisa, about that, some kind of noise from the presenter. Is this something that can be managed?
I think the control has to be from the source.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think the rest of us just have to mute the microphones except the person speaking.
Okay. All right, Dr. Tembo, proceed.
Okay, just to give a little bit of a background, what you see there is our cover page, the first slide, so to speak. And this is talking about the impact of Zambia's child grant program on child height. Basically, the child grant program is a version of the social cash transfers in Zambia, and very soon I'll be I will dwell a little bit on the evolution and background of social cash transfers since the days of the pilot in Kalomo. I'm sure a lot of us remember that pilot program that started all of this in Zambia. As we know right now, social cash transfers have become one of the biggest programs, social programs in Zambia. So I know that our interest as Sun LE is nutrition, and we have this as one of our outputs out of the work that we've been doing over the years on social cash transfers. So just to give a little bit of a summary of where we are coming from. I think somewhere around 2003, that's when the pilot was started in Kalomo. And over the years, for the next 4 or 5 years, the same model, the community-based targeting model, was expanded in pilot form to Chipata, Kazungula, and Monze. And there were some indications of impact that were coming out. I think Kalomo did not have a consistent and coherent baseline, so to speak, but there were indications that social class transfer seems to be getting us somewhere as far as poverty reduction is concerned. So in 2010, the government and the cooperating partners decided to make the intervention more systematic and to internalize impact evaluation. And that's when 2 versions or models, alternative models, were born for social cash transfers. The Child Grant Program and the Multiple Categorical Program. The Multiple Categorical Program, it used indicators of poverty, a combination of them, in targeting or identifying the beneficiaries. Whereas the Child Grant Program was using the presence of children under the age of 3. I think I will be presenting a little bit more detail on that in just a little bit. And then we know that from that time in 2010, there were a lot of lessons and also evidence of impact, solid evidence of impact. So much so that by 2015, the government decided to bring all these different versions of social cash transfers into the harmonized program. And then also they decided to scale up. As we speak right now, I think we are standing at about 628,000 households, which is 15% of Zambia's population. That's where we are, just to give a little bit of a background. So like I said earlier, there were 2 versions that came in 2010, the Child Grant Program and the Multiple Categorical. And for the Child Grant Program, it was not using poverty necessarily to target, but rather the presence of or hosting of a child under the age of 3 at that time. And this is an unconditional cash transfer. At the time, the household was receiving 55 Kwacha per month, and this has increased over time, and it has always been paid on a bi-monthly basis. There was no differentiation on the basis of other household characteristics like household size. Every household, no matter how many there were, received exactly the same size of a transfer. Our study, which we are going to present today, focuses on 3 of the Child Grant Program districts. That is Shangombo, Kalabo, and Kaputa. Just to give an overview of how the study has progressed over time, the baseline was conducted in 2010. This was just before the programming started. And then 2 years down the road, we went back and collected the data at the 24-month mark, which was in 2012. And the sample size, 2,298 at that time. The original sample size from the baseline, as you can see on top there, is 2,519. And so in 2013, we went again and did a 36-month follow-up. And at that time, we were able to reach 2,500 459 households. We're always going back to the baseline sample. So if we see differences because of attrition at that particular point in time, then in 2014, we again went back and were able to reach 2,423 of those households. I should mention that between the 36-month and the 24-month, there was another study, but it was carried out at a different season. And so it's not good for comparison with the others, because these others were done around October, November, December, thereabout. But we wanted to test the seasonality in 2013. So there is another way that we have not mentioned here. But these, for impact evaluation, for what we are presenting today, these are the ones. Then in 2017, if you recall, I just said that in 2015, all the programs were harmonized into the harmonized program, which we still have today. But in 2017, we wanted to test something different. For those households that participated but were no longer participating, what has happened to them? Today, that is not the subject that we are dwelling upon. This is something that we'll be presenting at another forum later on. But for now, we'll focus on the original design up to the 48-month follow-up. So just to give a little bit of background, how was this done? This was a longitudinal cluster randomized control trial. It is more like the gold standard of impact evaluation. I would have loved to go into more detail on impact evaluation, but for time, I think that is all I will say. But in terms of how we went about it, there were 2 stages in terms of selection. So in stage 1, we randomly selected the CWACS for the study, and that is 30 for each of the 3 districts. So for the 3 districts, we had a total of 90 CWACS. So there was randomization at the selection, the CWAC stage, selecting of which CWAC should be in the program. And stage 2, that is another randomization, randomly assign the CWACs to intervention or control. So the process of selecting which CWACs are in the treatment and which ones are in the control was also a random process. And I should also mention here that the study did not drive the program, but rather the way the program was designed, it internalized the impact evaluation. So in other words, those that were in the control, this is a delayed control. So there are no ethical issues per se. It was how the program was going to be implemented. So the question was, which CWACs should come in first and which ones should come in later and serve as a control. So for each district, we had 15 CWACs that were in the control and 15 that were in the treatment, making a total of 45, which is 90 for the 3 districts and for the entire study. These pictures that you can see, assuming you can see them, they depict the randomization process. It was done by the ministry itself, Ministry of Community Development and Social Services. So all those randomization stages that I spoke about, we traveled to the districts and had this done in each of the districts. I should also state that as we look at the impact or the results that we are going to see, we should also be mindful of the fact that a lot has happened and a lot has changed from the time that the study started to where we are today. So Kalabo, for example, was a very remote district, yet very close to Mongo at the time in 2010. So the pictures on the left-hand side, they show how it was like to go to Kalabo at that time during the baseline. And what you have on the right-hand side, it looks like a different country, right? This is the situation now, as we all know that Kalabo, Mongo, there is this ultra-modern road and bridge. So we should be mindful of these things as we go forward. I would also want to indicate a few characteristics of the sample at baseline, just to bring the context into light. So baseline extreme poverty rates, for example, were much higher than rural households in general in Zambia, much higher in these CGP districts. As we can see, it was standing, the green column there, 95.5 compared to the national average for rural Zambia, 65%. So these are some of the things that made the ministry choose these districts as a place to start from. And then again, CGP households were much more food insecure than all rural households at baseline. We see the green on the right-hand side compared to the yellow there for the rest of Zambia. Demographic profile of the CGP households also looked something like this, skewed to the right, where in the middle there we have pointed prime age adults and then preschoolers towards the left. But the point is the distribution was heavily skewed to the right. And then how this changed over time, we see that the distribution has over time has shifted, of course, to the right. If you look at the preschool children, the ages have shifted. Of course, that's expected over time. And then here we also show age distribution of young children at 48 months. This was the end line for the evaluation. And we see that a number of children were actually born during the study, a very large portion of the distribution of children. And we also see those that started receiving cash within the first year of their lives. And we have those that were born inside the study, of course. And there are some, by the time if they were born at the time of the baseline in 2010, by the time we were finishing the 48 months, they were 4 years old. By the time we went back in 2017, they were 7 years old. So this study has really been tracking these kids. I mentioned earlier that the methodology is an RCT, which is the gold standard. And on the left there, where you can see baseline, and in this figure, this is the point at which the randomization was being done. And we can see the blue line and the yellow line, they are just one on top of the other at the baseline point, basically confirming that the randomization worked. There were no systematic differences as far as this particular outcome variable is concerned between the treatment and the control households at baseline. And as we all know, we do impact evaluation, one, to show that there is something that has changed in the outcome variables from the time that the treatment was implemented, but also at the same time to be able to attribute that change to the intervention. And so one would argue, why don't we just check the before, which is at baseline, and the after? Why do we need the control? These are the nitty-gritties of impact evaluation, which we do not necessarily have the time to go into. But all I can say for now is that things don't necessarily remain the same over time. There are changes even in the group that is not being treated as time passes. As you can see earlier on, I showed the 2 points between the end line and the baseline. We've seen how Kalabo has transformed. Virtually, it's like a different place. So these dynamics are expected to affect not only the treatment households, but also the control households. And there are several other things that change over time. During the period of the evaluation, I think Zambia's economy was generally improving during that period. So there is the need to have what we call a counterfactual, and we use a control group which has been randomized to be exactly the same, except for the treatment at baseline. So that's what this figure is showing. When you look at the yellow one, this is for the control, that's the passage at different points in time that we collected the data. Baseline, 24 months, 36 months, and 48 months. And we see that the blue line is increasing, and also the yellow line was increasing at some point. So we use a technique called difference in difference. The difference in difference, there are two differences. Is the difference between the control and the treatment, and also the difference over time. This helps us to take into account any time invariant changes across over time. And so when you look at the arrow on the right there, it shows what we need to remove. We need to subtract this portion in order to get the effect of the program. Because if we remain at line 40 assumes there are no upward or downward changes in the trends of this outcome variable. But as we can see, both the control and the treatment actually did not remain at 40. And so the impact using difference in difference estimator would be what we have highlighted using green there, which is the difference between the two over time. At this point, I would like to hand over to Professor Ashu, so he can take us through the results and the rest of the presentation. Thank you. Hello?
Gelson, could you stop sharing? Then I'll share my screen.
Sure.
Can we see my screen then?
I can see it. The
Okay.
chair can see it. I hope others are able to see.
Excellent.
Please, Professor.
Yes, we can.
All right, great. So what I wanted to do now is I'll get into some of the results, and I also was hoping to, if I start my video, would that lead to connection problems, or can that work, or?
It's working just fine.
Okay, if it leads to connection problems, let me know and I can turn it off, all right? But I thought you could at least match the name with a face, you know, and know that there's not a robot here just, you know, speaking through the microphone. So I wanted to start off with just having us kind of remind ourselves about, you know, why we might expect an effect of a cash transfer on child nutrition, and think about the pathways a little bit. So actually, the evidence to date is not very promising, all right? And so a recent review, well, I guess not so recent now, since it was published a couple of years back, 2013, but they looked at 17 cash transfer programs, both conditional, that's the CCT, and unconditional, that's the UCT, all right? And they did a systematic review to see if there were any, you know, kind of takeaways in terms of this relationship between cash transfers and child nutrition. And unfortunately, the answer is that there's not, right? So there's not really any systematic evidence. You know, so yes, you might get one result here, one result there, but if you take the evidence, the body of evidence, it does not seem to show a positive effect of cash on nutrition, whereas, for example, a similar systematic review that looked at schooling did find positive effects. So, you know, that raises the question of why, okay? Or why not, I suppose. So let's go back to our familiar, you know, proximal determinants framework, right? And here we can see that, as we all know, there are these kind of three pillars, right, of pathways or determinants of child nutritional status. We have the, you know, the food pillar, right? The food intake, which is itself determined by, you know, household food security. And then we have the caring, that's the middle one, that's sort of the caring practices, like the behavioral change. And I understand that Sun is trying to work on this front, right? The behavioral change side. And then, of course, we have the disease environment, okay? And that's the sanitation and so on. So these are the three pillars. And so the question now is, and if you look at the underlying, so we've got the underlying determinants, these are the underlying, and then you've got the, you know, the distal or the structural or basic determinants down here. So if we look at this pathway, right, and you look at what the child grant or any other cash transfer is doing, it is essentially focused on this particular element, right? Because it's not a conditional program, it's not providing any complementary services such as nutritional education or anything like that. And so its primary intervention, right, it's moving this particular variable in this diagram, all right? Now, theoretically, this could affect all of our three pillars, okay? So clearly, you know, food security depends on your ability to buy food in part, right? You can also produce your own, but certainly if you can buy food, then that will improve food security. And so we could see the kind of direct relationship here, and that's why I've kind of drawn this star to kind of remind us that this link is fairly strong, okay? And there's lots of evidence around this link anyway. When you get to these other two pillars, though, the link between income, poverty, and these, you know, kind of intermediate or, you know, determinants of nutrition are tenuous. They're not so clear, right? If you think about caring practices, right? Just because a poor family gets a little bit more money, isn't going to affect caring practices without an intervention that directly addresses caring practices. Okay. Similarly, if you look at the disease environment, what's called in this framework the household health environment, again, you know, if people get some more money, they might invest in better housing quality. They might get a, you know, corrugated like a roof. They might enhance the structures of their walls. That might improve the disease environment a little bit, but ultimately a lot depends also on the kind of infrastructure available, whether there's a connection to water, right, to potable water, whether they can connect to electricity and so on. So these two other parts are kind of tenuous in terms of the evidence. And so you can see already that there are some question marks here about whether cash alone is going to be able to move our ultimate goal, right, which is, you know, stunting or chronic malnutrition, right? So let me dip into the main results here, okay? And then we'll open it up, and there's a lot to discuss, so I want to leave some time for that. So basically, this is the graph that Dr. Tembo showed you earlier, the kind of difference in differences. And here, let me just mention the sample, okay? The sample is children, it's what we call a repeated cross-section sample. So at each wave, we pick the kids 0 to 36 months, okay? So 0 to 3 years old. And it's a repeated cross-section. So we're comparing, in this case, the stunting rates, right, for kids 0 to 36 months at the baseline. Then at the 24 months, we're again picking kids 0 to 36 months. So this is, we're not exploiting the longitudinal or panel dimension of the survey at this point. We're just looking at a cross-section, okay? And we're comparing 0 to 36-month-old kids in the treatment group and the comparison group over time. And you can see that basically there's no separation, right? So none of these differences here are statistically significant, okay? So there's really no differences in the stunting rates. And the overall rates, as you can see, are around, you hover between 30 and 35%, basically, okay? We can do the same thing looking at the Z-score itself, the height for age Z-score. Again, this is the repeated cross-section sample. So we're not exploiting yet the cohort, the panel aspect. And obviously this is going to be like the mirror image of the stunting, right? So stunting goes up, that means that the height for age is going down, right? But as you can see, there's no separation, okay? Even, you know, 4 years out, right? You know, where you think, okay, this takes time, right? It takes some time to get this effect on height, on linear growth. The answer is, well, in this particular case, there were no effects, okay? We can, so these are just the graphs. We can obviously estimate all of this in a regression framework where we're able to control for other potential confounding factors, although there really shouldn't be any confounding factors because this is an RCT and the two samples, the treatment and control, were fully balanced. They were quite similar. They were strongly similar actually at baseline. So there really aren't confounding factors in this study design. Nevertheless, we can improve our power by adding in covariate. So like we can add in the mother's education, we can add in the distance to a market or to a main road, we can add in the age of the child, right? So, you know, the growth is highly nonlinear by age. And you could see that, and we've divided up the sample into, you know, the full sample, and we've looked at differences by sex, and none of these effects are statistically significant. This is for the height for age, okay? Now, this is the pooled cross-section. That's what I showed you in the previous slide. That's looking at kids 0 to 36 months at each wave, right? So these are obviously not the same kids because someone who was, say, 24 months at the baseline, by the time we came back at 48 months, they were not in the 0 to 36 age group, right? So here we're looking at the cohort sample. So this is actually the panel. This is where we are precisely following kids who were 0 to 36 months at the baseline, and then we follow them through the survey, through the study. So these are the exact same kids. Again, none of these are statistically significant. Now, some have argued that actually, you know, the first 1,000 days, the theory of the first 1,000 days is it's the early intervention that really makes a difference, right? So what we did was we picked kids who were 0 to 11 months of age at the baseline. And we followed those kids because we would say, okay, here the cash transfer started early enough for these kids that it could make a difference. Again, we see none of these differences are statistically significant, okay? And then finally, as Dr. Tembo pointed out, we had a nice sizable group of kids, about 1,100 kids over this period were actually born into the sample, which is quite interesting, right? So these kids were in the treatment group were always treated, right? They were born into a cash transfer family. So maybe the program had an effect, you know, on this particular group. The answer is no, none of these effects are statistically significant. That was for the mean height for age. This is just looking at stunting. And again, none of these are the 4 samples. None of these effects are statistically significant, okay? So, you know, up till now, our results are consistent with the review of the literature. Now, the question is, how about the pathways, okay? Did the CGP, did the social cash transfer affect any of the pathways? And the answer is most definitely, right? And so if you remember the pathways that we discussed, right, we've got the disease environment, right? We have the food pathway, and then we have the behavior, the caring practices, right? And so you could see that, in fact, the CGP had a very big effect on the food pathway, right? And we had a number of measures. We haven't even given you all of them here. But if you look at, for kids, we asked specifically how many meals did they eat, right, in the last 24 hours, for example. If you look at the household food expenditure per capita, very large increase. Meal frequency, very large increase. At the 48-month survey, we added, we really wanted to understand a little bit more about these pathways. So we added some questions about the types of food that the child had eaten so that we could figure out if they were protein rich or dairy. And you can see here that the diet diversity was definitely increasing for these kids, right? So, and then we also constructed an infant and young child feeding variable. There are a bunch of other variables, basically all telling the same thing, which is the food pathway was positively and significantly improved, affected by the CGP. And that, of course, is quite dependent directly on cash. However, the other pathways, the results are pretty much null, right? If we look at health inputs and behavior, mosquito net, morbidity, health card, and so on. And we even had a small a set of knowledge questions where we asked the caregiver about, you know, we asked them about which foods were rich in vitamin A, which foods, when should you, you know, introduce solid foods, and so on and so forth. And again, there were no effects on that, and we wouldn't expect that anyway. And again, here in the environment, the disease environment, you see that basically by 48 months, NS is not significant. So really no effects on that pathway, okay? So this is, to us, the clue somehow about why we don't see an effect on the ultimate outcome of nutrition, because the child grant is really only affecting, and did affect in a very important way, one of the 3 pathways, whereas you probably need, you know, all 3 of these pathways somehow to move, okay? So just to bring in some other evidence to stimulate the discussion, we did a health facility survey in these CWACS at the baseline, and just some ideas about what was going on in these facilities. So there are a total of 32 facilities. Most of them are health posts or dispensaries. So that's like the primary, health facility available to these households. The staffing was very low, as you can see. And again, this is way back in 2010. Obviously, things have changed. It's been 10 years. But the point is that at the start of this study, this was what the health infrastructure available to these households, right? So these facilities, very few had electricity, hardly any had a protected water source. If you look at the services that they provided, so on the one hand, almost all did provide a well baby clinic and ANC, but oops, this is supposed to be down here. Sorry, I was supposed to circle this. But you can see that very few provided treatment for acute malnutrition for children, for example, right? So kids who are in that state would have to be referred either to Mongu or, to the district capital, right? And then we also did an inventory of the drugs and supplies. And, so we asked, do you normally carry? And then we actually checked to see if it was in stock at the day of the interview. And you could see that, for example, something as critical as oral rehydration salts, which is critical for diarrhea, which we know is a big killer, right? Less than half of these facilities on the day of the survey actually had that crucial, drug, or I guess supply. And then you can also see that the stock of vaccinations is also quite low, although there are vaccination days and other stuff that might be more important, right? So in the interest of time, what I wanted to, this is a very busy slide. And so I think the main takeaway is what we did was we put together all the impacts of the child grant, right? And we decomposed them or separated them into different domains, like total consumption, food security, and assets, poverty, income and revenue that has to do with, selling, either having a non-farm enterprise or selling your farm output, debt, and so on. And you can see that across all of these indicators, this is 0. So all of these indicators, the effects are huge. So the CGP had these enormous effects on the household, right? On the household's basically economic position. But when it came to the kids, as you can see down here, all of these effects are near 0, right? And the confidence intervals are crossing 0. So, and here's our anthropometric. We created an index using the 3, weight for age, weight for height, and height for age. You see no effects, which is what I showed you, right? So this is the interesting puzzle, right? Which is that you have these enormous effects at the household level in terms of economic security, food security, and so on, income generation, livestock, and so on, but no effect on the kids themselves, which was sort of the objective of this program, right? So much so that when we put all those effects together, we calculated that there was actually a multiplier effect of this program, right? Instead, every kwacha that was transferred to these households, the households were able to use it productively to generate a multiplier, to generate an extra 0.49 kwacha, right? So, this is kind of the amount that was transferred over a year, and we were able to monetize all the effects that we observed. And this was the sum total of the monetary impacts. And you can see that that is much larger than the amount that was actually provided to the households. So these households are like really industrious. They generated, extra income. And yet we don't see this kind of trickling down to the kids, right? So I think this really brings us to our discussion items, right? Which is that, so you know, as we pointed out, so the CGP generated these large impacts on virtually all aspects of household well-being, except on child nutrition, right? However, we noted that it did improve the food pathway, right, which is one of the 3 key pathways to realizing gains in height. So, you know, the other pathways are not so dependent on cash per se, but they depend on other things working and happening, right? For example, the disease environment requires, you know, the infrastructure. The, you know, the behavioral, the caring practices requires both kind of some behavioral change and knowledge, but also, you know, health infrastructure and health facilities, right? And so those are less dependent directly on cash. And so obviously it kind of makes sense that the child grant, you know, wasn't really able to push those other pathways, right? Now, what our results are showing are something that's quite important, I think, for policy and practice, right? Which is that these results, these inputs, right, these pathways seem to be complementary. In other words, if you think about the concept of complementary, something that's a complement versus something that's a substitute, right? Something that's a substitute, it means that if I don't have this, then I can get this, and I can substitute it with this and get the same result. A complement means that the 2 things must go together to produce the output. Okay, and so some things in life can be substituted for, and some things in life cannot be substituted for. They need to go together. Okay, the extreme example is the, you know, the left shoe and the right shoe. Well, I cannot have 2 right shoes. The 2 have to go together to achieve the outcome, which is to, you know, allow me to go outside and run around. And so what we're finding is that to the extent, you know, that these inputs are complementary, then just working on one is not going to move the nutritional thing. So if Sun is working on, say, the behavioral change, that's one pathway. But if the inputs are complementary, that one pathway is not going to move the, you know, the end game, which is the nutritional outcomes, because you also need to move the other complementary inputs, right? So if I have the behavioral change, I know what to do, but I don't have the health infrastructure, or I don't have the money to buy the food, to prepare it, to buy the right food, you know, and so on. I know what the right food is, I just don't have the money to buy it. So you can see that these inputs are complementary. Working on one alone is not going to do the job, right? And so I think for us, the takeaway here is that, you know, the social cash transfer is clearly addressing one very important pathway, right? The food pathway. And to the extent that the Sun activities can be layered on to social cash transfer households, that's where I think the main kind of excitement will be, because that's when you'll get this complementarity that can boost, you know, boost nutritional outcomes. So I will leave it at there. I took a little bit more time than I wanted to. I got kind of excited over here. So I'll stop sharing, or I can continue sharing, but I'm going to hand over to the chair now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor and Dr. Tembo. This has been really wonderful presentation. And as I was seated here listening attentively, we have a pilot that we are trying to do in Mungwa in one ward, just to see whether convergence will work. Because one of the lessons from phase 1 of SUN was that there was no convergence of interventions at household level. And as such, in phase 2, we are trying to see how that can work. Hence, the small project that we are trying to do in Mungwa. Quite a lot of issues have come out from there, and quite clearly the message is clear that one pathway cannot have significant impact on reducing stunting. You need a combination. The message is very loud and clear. Okay, so now I will shift the chairmanship to Matthews to manage the discussion section. Matthews, are you there? Matthews, are you there?
Yes, I'm there, Freddie. Thank you very much.
You pick it up for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Freddie. Thank you, Ashu. Thank you, Dr. Tembo. So we are opening for discussion. I know there are several questions that people will want to ask. I think we will use, Professor Ashu wrote a text, sent a text that people could send questions. I see now a few questions are coming up, but we could also make use of the raising hand facility so that you can speak up and ask your question. So Ashu, do you want to start with the questions that have been sent by message, by text?
Sure. So there are a couple of questions. One is the issue of, conception, and really if you take the first 1,000 days. So the question was, shouldn't this intervention start early, like even at the, conception and like in utero phase? And I will say that there is a push in a bunch of countries now that have child grants, like even in South Africa, there's been quite a bit of discussion that as soon as that eligibility now should begin as soon as the mother is pregnant. So as soon as she knows she's pregnant, she can then immediately start receiving the grant, right? So I think there is there's more sensitivity to that on the policy front, right? I think policymakers are now convinced. Now, in our case, in this particular case for the CGP, we looked again at kids who were born into the program, right? So they were conceived, they were in utero already, right, when the grant was being received, and we still didn't see any effects on that, right? But of course, for those kids, our window was maybe only 2 years, right, in terms of looking at effects. So maybe for those kids, we might see the effects a little bit, right, longer in time. In terms of any other questions, let's see, we have a question from Rhoda. Okay, so Rhoda has to leave, but basically I think Rhoda was saying that these results seem pretty consistent with what they have been finding at IAPRI, right? So that basically just saying that, they work on one pathway, which is the food pathway, but not the others, and that doesn't seem to have an effect, enough of effect, right, on stunting. I would be interested to know about this pilot that I think, was it Freddie that had mentioned, in terms of what that convergence idea and what the target group is and what are the activities that are these cash transfer households that will then receive additional kind of education or behavioral change kind of support? Because I think that could be quite interesting. And then the question is, can we design some kind of evaluation around that, right, to see how successful it is?
Thank you, Ashu. Freddie, do you want to talk a little bit about the pilot?
Well, the pilot, basically, we are looking at delivering the package of nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive intervention. And these, of course, in terms of the, this is around the 6 priority areas that we've picked. That is nutrition-sensitive agriculture, and of course the economic dimensions, which is village savings and other empowerment initiatives. And then we also have the WASH, and of course the cross-cutting, which is mainly the social behavior change, as well as gender and women empowerment. Then of course we have now the healthcare practices part of it. So we have these 5 key components, which we are are actually trying to see whether if they are delivered to the same household, we could see much greater impact on reducing stunting. Yeah, so we are actually floating the advert to do some kind of baseline, and then we expect it's a 1 year, so 14 months project supported by Global Sun Poor Fund, just to try out some innovations and to support the multi-stakeholder platforms to deliver the package of interventions. That's what I can say for now. Specifically, we are not saying it's a social cash transfer, but if the social cash transfer is also within that word, it will still be considered as well, as part of the economic dimension aspect or pathway. Over.
Thank you very much, Freddie.
That could be very interesting because the Kenyan government also has a large social cash transfer, and they have about a year ago now they have started a they call it the niche program, but it's doing exactly this. It is, but that one is a little bit more targeted. They are picking exactly the cash transfer households and purposefully layering on the nutritional, these other kind of, they don't have the 5, but they have most of these that you mentioned, and purposely layering these activities onto those specific households, and they're evaluating that, right? So they're comparing those households with other cash transfer households without, you know, this layering to see what the value added is. So I think that could be quite an exciting, you know, opportunity in Zambia to also look at that, to see if somehow we can compare, you know, households who are receiving the cash plus these items versus maybe just these items and not the cash and so on, right? Just to kind of get a good understanding of what it takes to move, you know, chronic nutrition.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's getting late in the day. We are losing a few people. And I don't see any more questions. I think with the permission of the chair, I would like us to adjourn.
Sorry, Matthews, we had put our hands in the...
Oh, your hands are up. I didn't see. Okay, go ahead, Ruth.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I won't talk much. That's to say thank you to the presenters, but I think I would leave it to Lwindi because, and Mr. Mwanga, that there is a 1,000 days pilot that is being done building on these results to show that in the sun to whether it works. Because as we all know, it's a policy decision required and evidence was requested to show whether there should be an inclusion of an extra criteria of the 1,000 days. And the pilot that is being designed is meant to build on these results so that policy decision can be made around the inclusion criteria. But maybe I'll leave it to Lwindi and Mr. Mwanga.
Thank you, Ruth. Lwindi, are you there? Lwindi? Seems like Lwindi has dropped off, but we can pick up this discussion with her and see how this evidence can inform what the minister is thinking about.
Yes, Mr. Mwanga, I think you can also add, Lwindi, I think it's connectivity, she's still there. Mr. Mwanga, I think there's been some meetings and discussions. Maybe Mr. Mwanga can complement her.
Yeah, as Ruth rightly puts it, we are trying to see whether within the social cash transfer, if we incorporate or expand the target of the 1,000 days, that is households with children under 2, the pregnant and lactating. And we also do layering of these other interventions. And shall we be able to see a greater impact in terms of reduction in stunting through the cash transfer pathways? So this will be piloting it in 2 districts, and we are currently just in discussions to finalize on the issues of the protocol, and then we'll proceed.
Okay.
Wendy, are you there? I can see the hand is there.
Luindi, just speak.
Okay, so, well, this
Okay.
is the project that we'll be doing with the support of UNICEF, and we'll be working with the Ministry of Community Development. So we'll provide more information as we proceed, when we commence the actual implementation. Unless, Ruth, if you have anything to add on.
No, just to say that this research is the one which actually has given birth to the next one. The results pointed to the need to do a bit more layering of and understanding of the pathways for policy decision. Over.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any hand up which I can't see?
Yeah, Wendy still has a hand up, but don't know what could be the problem.
She has a technical problem, maybe. Okay, so I think there's more for us to learn, and we'll be really learning more from the other pilot projects that are planned. But we just want to thank you, presenters, for getting time to give us this presentation. It's really enlightening. And if possible, Dr. Ashu and Dr. Tembo, could you share your slides so that we can also have them?
Yeah, we'll share them with, I guess I'm in touch with either John or Matthews, yeah,
Okay, sure.
or Stephanie. And just to
you.
say that we, any kind of support we can provide in terms of the evidence, on the evidence side, either the design of the evaluation or anything like that, you know, UNC is ready. I guess we're you know, part of the Sun LE team, but certainly we would be very, you know, happy to help with that, to make sure we can take advantage, right, and learn from it. But thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Freddie, any closing remarks?
Well, just to thank the presenters and of course San Elohi for hosting. This has been really informative, and we will continue to strive and build the evidence so that we help with decision making as regards policy as well as programming. So this has really been useful, and we thank you, Professor Handa and Dr. Tembo, for the clear presentation, and we hope we will still interact should we need any further support towards this angle. Otherwise, let me thank everybody who has participated and for their input. So for now, it's bye from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Muganga. It's nice to see you on the screen after a long time.
Is that so?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, here I am. Okay, bye everybody.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Goodbye.
Uh,